During the observer phase, what seemed like paralysis was, in truth, a silent process of deep reorganization of consciousness. The sensation of watching one's own life as if separated from it did not indicate failure or spiritual delay, but entry into an advanced stage of perceptual training. Reality stopped responding immediately because the focus was no longer on external events, but on the internal stability of the one who observes. During this period, consciousness was removed from automatic reaction mode and placed into a state of sustained neutrality, something rare and demanding. The external world became almost motionless, precisely so that attention could learn not to collapse possibilities out of impulse, anxiety, or fear. This describes that moment as the final phase of a quantum simulator, in which life itself behaves like a hyper-realistic training field. Nothing that occurred during this interval was random. Every delay, every silence, every sensation of emptiness served the function of testing the ability to remain present without interference. The training did not consist of acting better, thinking positively, or forcing visualizations, but of sustaining a state of pure observation in front of a field of infinite possibilities. Consciousness needed to prove it could maintain stable attention without choosing a smaller reality out of desperation or impatience. Within this simulator, reality operates according to the principle of superposition. Before focused observation, all possibilities exist simultaneously as pure potential. The future is not defined. It presents itself as a vibrant holographic field containing every possible version of experience. When attention fixes on a specific point in that field, the wave function collapses, and one of those possibilities becomes concrete experience. For most of life, this collapse happens unconsciously, guided by old beliefs, traumas, fears, and unexamined emotional patterns. The observer phase interrupts this automatic process. By being withdrawn from active participation, the individual stops unconsciously reinforcing the same outcomes. Life enters a state of apparent suspension because consciousness is learning not to react. Neutrality, which at first feels like apathy or stagnation, is actually a state of enormous power. Holding attention without judgment, without expectation, and without attempts to control is the central skill being developed. This skill demonstrates to the reality system itself that the observer is no longer reactive, no longer volatile, no longer choosing out of fear. This makes it clear that this period was a final examination. The frustration felt was part of the difficulty of the test. The confusion was the level of complexity of the learning. Each time the urge arose to interfere, to force results, to give up, or to conclude that nothing was working, consciousness was invited to remain stable. And each time it managed to sustain that stability, a new level of internal coherence was reached. Approval does not come with an immediate external notice, but with a silent shift in the individual's vibrational signature. When the observer phase ends, what the text calls graduation occurs. This graduation is not symbolic, but functional. It means consciousness has demonstrated the capacity to sustain superposition without collapsing prematurely. It means attention has become a stable point, capable of anchoring broader possibilities without being lost in automatic reactions. Reality then alters its protocol. What once seemed blocked begins to reorganize, not because something new was done, but because something essential was integrated. One of the first signs of this graduation is the dissolution of compulsive desire. The text explains that intense desire is born from a sense of lack. When consciousness stabilizes at a higher state, this sense of lack loses strength. This is not resignation or disinterest, but a deep calm that arises when identity no longer depends on a specific outcome to feel complete. What was once pursued with anxiety begins to feel distant, not due to devaluation, but due to vibrational transcendence. The individual stops being a field of need and becomes a field of presence. Another important sign is the emergence of neutral synchronicities. Repeating numbers, subtle patterns, symbolic repetitions begin to appear without intense emotional charge. They provoke neither euphoria nor despair, only quiet recognition. These synchronicities function as connection tests, like ping signals sent by reality to verify whether consciousness is present, attentive, and stable. The fact that they are perceived without emotional attachment indicates that communication is clear, the channel is open, and consciousness no longer depends on dramatic confirmations. There is also the sudden disappearance of old problems, or more precisely, of the emotional charge associated with them. Situations that once dominated attention simply stop mattering. Sometimes the problem resolves externally, other times it remains but without internal impact. This happens because the function of that challenge has been fulfilled. It existed as part of the training, as a specific scenario designed to test the capacity for observation without reaction. Once the pattern is learned, the program is uninstalled. Reality does not insist on lessons that have already been integrated. With the conclusion of this phase, the role of consciousness inverts. Before, attention was trained not to collapse. Now it is used to collapse consciously and precisely. This is the new paradigm described. Conscious collapse. Consciousness ceases to be merely a witness and assumes the role of architect. This does not mean acting with effort, but declaring with clarity. Creation no longer arises from desire, but from identity. Reality responds not to requests, but to commands issued from a state of internal coherence. This emphasizes that true change did not occur because of something that was done, but because of what was become. Identity was refined during the observer phase. The individual who emerges from this period is by nature compatible with broader realities. For this reason, creation becomes simpler. There is no more struggle, only alignment. Consciousness does not try to convince the universe, it informs. It does not wait for signs, it is the sign. This shift also alters the relationship with time. Physical reality has a natural delay, an echo effect. Old situations may still briefly appear, not as failures of the process, but as residues of a previous vibrational signature. Recognizing these echoes without reacting is part of mastery. When they receive no emotional attention, they dissipate. Attention, now disciplined, feeds only what corresponds to the new identity. The practice suggested here does not involve complex visualizations or elaborate rituals. It is based on 3 pillars: conscious declaration, attention diet, and neutrality toward echoes of the past. Declaration is not a request, but a decree. The attention diet consists of withdrawing energy from old narratives. Neutrality toward echoes prevents the past from being reactivated. This simple set sustains the transition from observation to deliberate creation. At the end of this phase, consciousness no longer perceives itself as an isolated point. It recognizes its entangled nature with the collective field. Personal power expands into co-creation. Reality ceases to be something that happens to the individual and becomes something that organizes itself around them. This is the fundamental shift described. From spectator to axis, from reaction to command, from waiting to presence. Everything that was lived during the observer phase, including pain, frustration, and silence, was part of a gestational process. Nothing was wasted. Each moment of sustained neutrality reinforced the internal coherence necessary for this new stage. Graduation is not the end of the path, but the beginning of a different way of existing, an existence in which consciousness no longer seeks outside what it has already become within. In the second part of this process, the most important inversion of all, deepens. The understanding that throughout the entire period in which you believed you were observing reality, it was reality itself that was observing you. This is the conceptual rupture point that completely redefines the experience of the observer phase. The human mind tends to assume it is always in the active position, analyzing, evaluating, waiting for external signs. However, what occurred at this stage was the opposite. The universe, understood here as the total field of consciousness and potential, suspended external responses precisely to evaluate who you would become when nothing happened. The absence of movement, confirmations, and visible results was not negligence or punishment. It was a controlled environment, similar to an empty stage where there was no script, stimulus, or external direction. In that scenario, the only observable variable was your internal state. The fundamental question being tested was not, what do you do when everything goes right? But, who are you when there is nothing to react to? No applause, no rewards, no dramatic crises, no distractions. Just you, your attention, and silence. This makes it clear that at this point, consciousness stops being the audience and reveals itself as the central processor of the simulator. There is no real separation between observer and system. Consciousness was not watching a simulation. It was the core that kept the system running. The test consisted of verifying whether this core could sustain a frequency of trust, presence, and neutrality even when the monitor of reality seemed turned off or displaying images contrary to personal desire. Each time anxiety arose, the simulation observed. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, and you feel ready to deepen this experience, I've left a more complete material in the pinned comment. You don't need to look at it now. Just remember it when the time feels right. Each time silent faith arose, it also observed. Every moment of inner resignation, every moment of conscious surrender, every choice to remain present instead of collapsing into fear, everything was recorded as fundamental data. The universe did not respond because it was collecting information about your stability. It did not need external actions. It needed to measure internal coherence. This is why so many traditional practices seem to lose effect during this period. Visualizations, affirmations, attempts to manifest something specific felt empty or even counterproductive. According to the logic presented, this happened because any attempt to force a result was interpreted as interference. It was as if the operator, still in training, tried to take control before proving they could keep their hands steady. The system, therefore, kept the controls locked. The central learning of this phase was conscious non-interference. This is not passivity, but perceptual mastery. Consciousness needed to learn to sustain the field of all possibilities without choosing one out of emotional lack. This required facing the discomfort of emptiness, the frustration of waiting, and the constant temptation to return to old reactive patterns. The silence of reality was the weight of the training. This emphasizes that the real work was not external. There was nothing to conquer, fix, or accelerate. The work was in maintaining an internal state of trust, even when the world offered no guarantees. Each time you chose to remain whole without answers, something inside you reorganized. The axis of identity stopped depending on what happened outside and began anchoring in what was sustained within. It is at this point that the definitive shift of identity occurs. Consciousness stops perceiving itself as someone waiting for something to happen and begins to recognize itself as the space in which everything happens. This shift is not intellectual. It is vibrational. It does not arise as a new thought, but as a feeling of internal solidity. The individual begins to feel, even without external proof, that something is already resolved at a deeper level. This moment is described as the inevitable conclusion of the training. Graduation does not occur because something finally worked in the external world, but because the internal state reached a level of coherence that no longer oscillates easily. Reality recognizes this and, from that point on, changes the form of interaction. There is no formal announcement. The shift is perceived through subtle signs: deep relaxation, the absence of urgency, the feeling that it is no longer necessary to chase. This is the point where the paradox resolves. What seemed like stagnation reveals itself as gestation. Time that felt wasted shows itself as incubation time. Silence that seemed like abandonment reveals itself as the system's attentive observation. The consciousness that survived this period without fragmenting proved it can sustain more creative energy without collapsing into chaos. From this conclusion onward, Reality stops functioning as a constant test and begins responding as a collaborative environment. But this response does not come as an immediate external reward. It comes as access. Consciousness is granted permission to operate from another level, not because it asked, but because it demonstrated capacity. This second part makes it clear that the observer phase was not something that happened to you. It was something you crossed, sustained, and integrated. The universe was not delayed. It was attentive. And what determined the conclusion of this stage was not a specific action, but the silent consistency of who you became when no one, not even reality, seemed to be watching. From the moment this understanding settles, something fundamental changes in how you relate to reality. You stop interpreting the period of stagnation as an error or delay and begin recognizing it as a technical, precise, and necessary process. What once seemed like a meaningless void reveals itself as a calibration field. Silence was not absence of movement. It was fine-tuning. The lack of external response was not rejection. It was containment. The universe was not ignoring you. It was observing you, measuring the stability of your internal state, testing whether your consciousness could sustain neutrality in the absence of visible results. This was the real criterion of the test. During this period, you believed you were looking at life, analyzing possibilities, waiting for signs, trying to understand when something would finally happen. But that perception was inverted. Reality was not being examined by you. You were being examined by reality. Every moment you chose not to react. Every instant you resisted the urge to interfere. Every time you remained present when everything seemed frozen. This was recorded. The universe observed whether you would maintain coherence when the scenario did not confirm your desires, whether you would remain at peace without guarantees, who you would become without any external reinforcement. This is the turning point that redefines the entire process. You were not waiting for reality to change so you could then trust. Reality was waiting for you to become someone who trusts regardless of what is seen. Emotional stability, conscious neutrality, the absence of desperation. This was not preparation for future creation. This was creation itself. Each time you chose presence over anxiety, you were encoding a new vibrational base. Each time you chose inner silence over resistance, you were stabilizing the field. What you called observation was, in fact, the construction of the foundation. That is why graduation does not happen when something external finally manifests. It happens when you become irreversibly different inside. It was not a technique that worked, not a stronger visualization, not additional effort. It was a shift of identity. You stopped being someone who needed something to happen in order to feel complete. This internal displacement is the true sign that the observer phase has ended. Creation stops being an attempt and becomes a natural consequence of your state. This is why this content reaches you now. It is not coincidence, not luck, not an algorithmic accident. The very existence of this message in your experience indicates that your internal field has already become compatible with this level of understanding. This kind of information does not find an unstable consciousness. It requires a prepared field, someone who has already crossed the void without collapsing. The simple fact that these words make sense, that they resonate deeply, confirms that the transformation has already occurred. Waiting, then, must be reinterpreted. What seemed like delay was, in fact, gestation. The universe was not denying. It was protecting. It was not postponing. It was shaping. It was ensuring that when reality finally collapsed into concrete form, you would have the internal structure to sustain it without fear, without sabotage, without excessive need for control. The observer phase exists to prevent the creator from destroying what they do not yet know how to hold. With this, a complete inversion of position occurs. You stop being someone who looks for signs and become the sign itself. You stop seeking external validation and become the reference point. The consciousness that once observed now emanates. Reality, which once seemed distant and autonomous, begins responding by resonance. You no longer need to chase events, people, or opportunities. Your internal coherence begins to function as a gravitational field. Circumstances organize themselves around you not by effort, but by alignment. This is the moment when the identity of the observer definitively ends. Not because observation ceases to matter, but because observation is no longer passive. Observation becomes active, directive, intentional. Your internal state becomes the organizing center of experience. You no longer react to reality. You set the tone. You no longer wait for permission. You sustain presence. And it is precisely this stability that allows the next stage of the process, the recognition of objective signs that graduation has occurred. These signs do not appear as spectacular events. They emerge subtly, almost silently, and for that reason are often misinterpreted. One of the first indications is the dissolution of intense desire. What once felt urgent, vital, indispensable, begins to lose emotional charge, not because you gave up, but because the need disappeared. Desire, which arises from lack, no longer makes sense when internal identity already feels whole. This shift does not generate emptiness, it generates calm. Not frustration, but neutrality. It confirms that you are no longer vibrating in absence, but in sufficiency. Another clear sign is the emergence of neutral synchronicities. Small patterns repeat without provoking exaggerated excitement or emotional dependence. Numbers, words, symbols appear, and you notice them, but you do not cling. There is no desperation for meaning, only recognition. This indicates that communication between your consciousness and the field is stable. The system tests the channel before transmitting something larger. These small signals function as technical confirmations that the field is receptive, coherent, and responsive. There is also the sudden disappearance of problems that once seemed central. In some cases, they resolve externally. In others, they simply stop mattering. The emotional charge vanishes. The drama dissolves. The theme loses relevance. This does not happen through denial, but because the lesson has been integrated. The system does not keep challenges active when the frequency required to transcend them has already been incorporated. The program ends. Reality conserves energy. All these signs point to the same conclusion. The observation phase has been completed. The training is over. Consciousness has demonstrated enough stability to move from merely witnessing to commanding. From this point on, the relationship with reality changes in nature. The focus shifts from understanding to direction. Observation no longer serves to analyze what is, but to determine what consolidates. This requires a new posture, not the posture of one who waits, but of one who declares, not of one who asks, but of one who recognizes. The consciousness that crossed silence now sustains presence, and it is this presence, silent, firm, coherent, that begins to collapse reality with precision. Creation stops being effort and becomes response. When this new posture stabilizes, consciousness enters a different territory, where effort completely loses its function. The attempt to control, anticipate, or predict begins to feel strange, almost artificial. Not because you cannot act, but because you perceive that correct action arises on its own, at the exact moment, without internal pressure. At this point, life stops being something that needs to be managed and becomes something that moves through you. The feeling is not power, but alignment. Not euphoria, but silent clarity. You begin to notice that the most important decisions no longer come with mental conflict. They appear as immediate recognition, almost bodily. There is no internal debate, only quiet certainty. This does not mean absence of thought, but absence of noise. The mind continues to function, but now as an instrument, not as commander. This is one of the clearest signs that this has occurred. Thought stops leading and begins serving. At this stage, the relationship with time also transforms. Urgency diminishes drastically. The future stops being a place where something must happen for you to feel complete. The past loses strength as a reference for identity. Both become information, not anchors. The present expands, not as a philosophical concept, but as a practical experience. You notice that the more present you are, the less you need to do for things to organize themselves. Coherence replaces effort. Here, what was once called manifestation begins to happen almost invisibly. There are no rituals, no attempts, no compulsive repetition of intentions. Situations simply rearrange themselves. People appear, paths open, conversations happen, decisions align. And all of this occurs without generating extreme surprise, because internally you were already prepared for it. Reality merely confirms what was already resolved within you. This phase often confuses those who still associate conscious creation with control. But what happens here is the opposite. The less you try to manipulate, the more reality responds. The less you force, the more fluidity appears. This occurs because the internal field has stopped emitting contradictory signals. There is no longer intense desire mixed with fear. Intention mixed with doubt, will mixed with lack. The signal is clean, and a clean signal generates precise responses. You also notice that there is no longer a need to prove anything, not even to yourself. Comparison loses strength. Other people's pace ceases to be a reference. You understand directly that each consciousness is at a different point on the spiral, and that there is no advantage in artificially accelerating processes. This understanding generates compassion, not superiority. Silence, not discourse. The more you understand, the less you need to explain. Another striking aspect of this stage is the gradual dissolution of the fear of making mistakes. Not because you became perfect, but because you understand that there is no error outside of unconsciousness. Every conscious experience generates learning, adjustment, and realignment. Fear, which once functioned as a brake, loses its utility. You begin to act more naturally, not through forced courage, but because paralysis no longer makes sense. Action flows from the same place as stillness. From here on, reality begins to function as an extremely refined feedback system. Small internal deviations generate subtle, quick, almost immediate responses, not as punishment, but as adjustment. You notice when something goes off center, not because something goes wrong, but because the internal feeling shifts. The body signals, intuition alerts, flow diminishes. This allows for gentle corrections without crises, without ruptures, without unnecessary suffering. This is the phase in which trust ceases to be abstract. You trust because you see, feel, and experience the constant response of the field. It is not blind faith, it is recognition. Reality becomes predictable at the vibrational level, even if unpredictable in form. You may not know exactly how something will happen, but you know it will happen if the internal state is aligned. This certainty does not generate anxiety, it generates tranquility. With this, the old identity begins to dissolve definitively. There is no conflict, no intense mourning. The stories you use to repeat about yourself simply lose relevance. You no longer need to define yourself by what you lived, what you suffered, or what you overcame. Identity becomes state, not narrative. You are what you sustain now, not what happened before. This is the point at which consciousness begins to touch what was described as unity in a practical, not conceptual way. You perceive, in simple everyday experiences, that separation is functional, not real. People stop being seen as obstacles or threats and begin to be understood as expressions at different frequencies. This does not mean agreeing with everything, but understanding everything. Judgment loses strength because understanding increases. Presence becomes constant, not intense. There are no mystical peaks, but there is stability. And it is precisely this stability that allows access to deeper states without imbalance. The more normal this becomes, the less need there is to talk about it. Transformation stops being an event and becomes the background of experience. This part of the process does not draw external attention. On the contrary, it often appears invisible to those observing from outside. But internally, everything is different. Perception is broader, reaction is smaller, clarity is greater. You feel that something has closed, and at the same time, something has opened. Not as a new objective, but as a new way of existing. And it is precisely this silent stabilization that prepares the ground for the next movement, one that no longer depends on any human effort, because it arises from a point where consciousness no longer confuses itself with identity. From here, access to the deepest state becomes possible, not as an exception, but as a return. At this point, everything simplifies. Consciousness no longer needs to make an effort to sustain elevated states because they have become natural. Observation is no longer separate from action, and creation no longer requires explicit intention. Reality responds because it finds no internal resistance. Silence becomes productive, not empty. Presence sustains itself without vigilance. The old identity no longer returns with force. When old thoughts arise, they are recognized as echoes and immediately lose impact. There is no struggle, only recognition and release. The mind functions with precision, but without compulsion. The body accompanies this adjustment with more relaxation, more clarity, and less tension. Trust ceases to be a choice and becomes a reflex. There is no expectation of the future and no attachment to the past. The now sustains everything. Life organizes itself with enough fluidity for you to realize that you do not need to interfere. Being aligned is enough. Here, the process ends without a sense of ending. Nothing needs to be concluded because nothing is pending internally. Movement continues, but the search ends. Consciousness returns to the center and remains. If this message truly resonated with you, if you felt that quiet inner shift, that sense that your mind is ready for something greater, I left a resource in the pinned comment that goes deeper into this process. I only recommend it for those who feel genuinely ready to accelerate their results, but follow it in your own time. If it calls to you, you'll find it there.